The gavel came down like a death sentence. Sold to the man in the black coat. Clara Whitmore did not scream. She did not beg. She stood on that splintered wooden platform with her son pressed against her side, and her jaw locked so tight her teeth ached, and she stared out at the faces of Iron Mesa. Faces she had known for years, and watched every single one of them look away. Every one of them. Until the dust at the far end of Main Street shifted, and a lone rider came through it like a ghost that hadn't decided yet whether it was angry or merciful. Before we go any further, if this story already has your heart pounding, do me a favor right now. Hit that subscribe button and follow along until the very end, because this one doesn't let up. Drop a comment and tell me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Now let's get back to Iron Mesa, because that rider isn't done yet. The morning it happened, Clara had prayed. She wasn't a woman who prayed often, not in the performative way some of her neighbors did, loud and public and satisfied with themselves afterward. She prayed the way a person prays when they've run out of everything else. Quietly. On her knees beside the cot where Eli was still sleeping, his small fist curled under his chin, his breathing soft and even, and completely unaware that by noon his mother might not be his mother anymore in the eyes of the law. She had prayed for a miracle, for the ground to open up, for Daniel to somehow not be dead. Daniel had been dead for 4 months, and Horace Granger had been patient for exactly 4 months and 3 days before he sent his man Rudd to the door with the paperwork. She'd read it twice before she understood it. Then she read it a third time, standing in the cold doorway in her nightgown, and the words stopped being words and started being a wall, closing in from every direction. Debt of outstanding balance, $412. Pursuant to the terms of the loan agreement signed by Daniel Whitmore on the 14th of March, 1878, all assets of the estate are subject to liquidation. Said assets to include land, livestock, household effects, and, in the event of insufficient collateral, dependent persons. Dependent persons. She had looked up at Rudd. He was a wide man with no particular expression on his face, the kind of man who had made a career out of delivering bad news without feeling any of it. "That's a legal document," he said. "Mr. Granger will expect you and the boy at the auction platform at 10 o'clock. "The boy is 6 years old," Clara said. Rudd shrugged. "Yes, ma'am." She had dressed Eli carefully that morning. She didn't know why. She found herself buttoning his shirt all the way to the collar, smoothing his hair back from his forehead, buffing the scuff marks off his boots with the hem of her apron, as if presentation could protect them somehow, as if looking respectable might make this less of what it was. "Mama," Eli said, watching her face, "are we going to town?" "Yes, baby." "Is it a good reason or a bad reason?" Clara looked at her son for a long moment. His eyes were Daniel's eyes, dark brown with gold flecks at the center, eyes that always looked like they were about to ask a question, even when the mouth was staying quiet. "We're going to be all right," she said, which wasn't an answer, but it was all she had. Iron Mesa on a Thursday morning was never particularly lively, but word traveled fast in small towns, and whatever Horace Granger had done in the way of advertising, and Clara suspected it had been deliberate, the street was already crowded when Rudd brought them in on the wagon. She heard the murmuring before she saw the platform. It was a cattle auction platform. She had stood near it a dozen times over the years, watching the hands run steers through, while the ranchers leaned on the rail and called out numbers. She had never imagined standing on it herself. Granger was already there when they arrived. He was a compact man with precise features and a way of standing that suggested he considered himself the most important person in any room he entered. He wore his money visibly. Good wool coat, polished boots, a watch chain that caught the light. He didn't look at Clara when she stepped down from the wagon. He looked at his watch. "You're 3 minutes late," he said. "Mr. Granger." Clara's voice was steadier than she expected. "I am asking you in front of these people to stop this." He finally looked at her then. Something moved behind his eyes. Not quite contempt, not quite satisfaction. Something more deliberate than either. "Mrs. Whitmore," he said, "your husband borrowed money from my bank. He signed an agreement. He is deceased without having honored that agreement. I am operating entirely within the law." "He borrowed $200, Clara said. "The paper your man brought me said 412. "Interest accrues, ma'am." "Not at that rate, it doesn't." Something shifted in Granger's expression. Just a flicker. Gone before she could name it. "Sheriff Beaumont has reviewed the documents and found them to be in order," Granger said. "You are welcome to dispute that assessment in a court of law. The nearest circuit judge arrives in approximately 6 weeks." He paused. "The auction begins in 5 minutes." She stood on that platform with Eli's hand in hers, and she counted faces. There was Edna Marsh from the dry goods store, who had once spent an entire afternoon helping Clara pick out fabric for Eli's winter coat. Edna was looking at her shoes. There was Pastor Goodwin, who had presided over Daniel's funeral and told Clara that God's plan was not always visible to human eyes. He was standing at the edge of the crowd with his hat in his hands, turning it over and over. There was Jim Hollis, who had ranched next to them for 3 years, and who she had fed supper at least a dozen times when his wife was ill. Jim was looking somewhere above her head, studying the roofline of the building behind her. None of them were going to stop this. That realization settled through Clara like cold water poured slowly from the top down. She had somehow, until this very moment, believed that someone would stop it, that the town she had lived in and worked in and buried her husband in would not actually allow this to happen. She had been wrong. Granger's man Rudd stepped up beside her and addressed the crowd with the flat professional delivery of a man who had run livestock auctions before and saw no meaningful difference in today's proceedings. "We are here to settle outstanding debt against the estate of Daniel Whitmore, deceased. On offer, one widow woman, Clara Whitmore, age 26, in good health. One male child, Eli Whitmore, age 6. Bidding opens at $50. A sound went through the crowd. Not protest. More like the sound a room makes when everyone in it shifts uncomfortably at the same time. Clara looked straight ahead. She did not look at Eli. She was afraid that if she looked at her son, she would break. And she could not break. Not here. Not in front of Horace Granger. $50, said a voice from the left side of the crowd. Walt Duggan. He ran horses north of town and had a wife who never came into town anymore. Clara had heard things about why. Her stomach dropped to the dirt. 60, said another voice. A stranger, someone she didn't recognize. 75, Duggan again. He was smiling, not the kind of smile that had anything pleasant behind it. Eli's fingers tightened around hers. "Mama," he whispered. "Don't look at him," Clara said quietly. "Look at me. Just at me." The boy turned his face up to hers, and Clara fixed her eyes on his and willed herself not to cry, not to flinch, not to give a single person in that crowd the satisfaction of watching her come apart. $100, a new voice, rougher, from the right side. 125, Duggan again, louder this time, like he was enjoying the competition. Granger stood off to the side, with his hands clasped behind his back and the same precise expression he always wore. And Clara looked at him, really looked at him, and understood for the first time with complete clarity that this was not about the money. The money was real. The debt might even have been real in some version of events. But the satisfaction on Horace Granger's face was not the satisfaction of a businessman recouping a loss. It was something older and uglier than that. He wanted her gone. He wanted her broken. He wanted the land her husband had left her. And he wanted her spirit crushed so thoroughly that she would never be capable of questioning how he'd gotten it. $140, said the rougher voice. He was pushing closer now, a wide-shouldered man with a red face and the careful movements of someone who had been drinking since morning. $150, Dugan said. Clara's jaw was aching. She realized she had been clenching it for so long, the muscles were beginning to cramp. Pastor Goodwin finally spoke. His voice came out thin and uncertain from the edge of the crowd. Mr. Granger, surely there's some other arrangement. The law is the law, Pastor, Granger said pleasantly, without turning around. We don't get to choose which parts of it apply. Goodwin went quiet. His hat kept turning. $180, the drunk man called, louder now. He had worked his way to the front of the crowd and was looking up at Clara with an expression that made the cold water feeling in her chest turn to something that had edges and teeth. And then the crowd shifted. Not all at once. It happened first at the back, the way a wave starts far out at sea, and the shore doesn't know it yet. Heads turned. Murmuring changed character, from the low, guilty murmur of people watching something wrong to something more uncertain, more alert. Hooves on packed dirt, slow and deliberate. Clara heard it before she could see the source of it. One horse. Walking, not running. Unhurried. The crowd parted the way crowds do when something about a person's bearing tells them without a word being spoken that this is not a man who will stop because you're in the way. He was not impressive to look at first. Dust-covered coat, trail-worn hat pulled low, a face that hadn't seen a razor in at least a week. He rode a bay horse that was road-tired and showing it, and he did not come in fast or dramatic or with any of the flourishes that dime novels like to attach to this kind of moment. He just came in, and he stopped. His eyes went to Clara first. 1 second, taking in the platform, the setup, the situation, with the swift, quiet assessment of a man accustomed to walking into circumstances that required rapid understanding. Then his eyes went to Horace Granger. "What's the current bid?" he said. His voice was low, unhurried, like the walk his horse had made through the crowd. Rudd blinked at him. "Sir, this is a private—" "I can see what it is." His eyes hadn't moved from Granger's face. "What's the current bid?" Granger studied the stranger, with an expression that was still composed, still precise, but something behind the composure had shifted, the way a man's expression shifts when he's recalculating. $180, Granger said. The stranger reached into his coat. He produced a leather pouch that made a sound when he set it on the railing of the platform, a heavy, definitive, metallic sound that silenced every other noise in the street. $200, he said. Gold. I'll take them. The silence that followed was the loudest thing Clara had ever heard. It lasted long enough that Eli looked up from her face to see what had caused it, and Clara's hand tightened on his instinctively, reflexively, the way a person grabs something precious when the ground shifts. Walt Duggan laughed. It was an ugly sound. "Who in the hell are you supposed to be?" The stranger didn't look at Duggan. He kept his eyes on Granger, and his expression was the expression of a man waiting to find out whether the other person in the room is going to be reasonable or whether they're going to make a different kind of problem. $200 is more than the opening bid, the stranger said. Under the terms of this auction, as stated, that closes it. Granger's jaw tightened. Just barely. I don't believe I know you. No, the stranger agreed. You don't. You're not from Iron Mesa. No. Then I'd be curious to know what business you have. My business, the stranger said quietly, is that gold on that rail, and the terms your man announced to this crowd 10 minutes ago. You set the rules, Mr. He paused, waiting. Granger. Mr. Granger. I'm operating by them. Another silence. This one had a different quality. The crowd was very still. Even Dugan had stopped moving. There was something about the way the stranger held himself. Not threatening, not posturing, just entirely, absolutely calm, that made the air around him feel different from the air around anyone else on the street. Granger looked at the pouch of gold. Then he looked at the stranger. Then something moved across his face and settled into the expression of a man who has decided to take a longer road. Very well, Granger said. Rudd, process the transaction. Clara came down from the platform on her own. Nobody offered a hand. The stranger had dismounted and was standing beside his horse at the rail, and she walked toward him because there was nowhere else to walk. And when she reached him, she stopped and looked at him, and tried to read his face, and found she couldn't. I don't know you, she said. No, ma'am. I don't know why you did that. Something moved in his expression. Not quite a smile, more like a decision being made about how much to say. You got somewhere to be? He said. Clara looked back at the crowd that was already beginning to disperse, back to their days and their business and the ordinary life of a town that had just watched something monstrous happen, and intended to forget about it by supper time. She looked at Horace Granger, who was speaking quietly to Rudd, with his back turned and his hands clasped behind him. She looked at Eli, who was standing at her side with his eyes fixed on the stranger with the serious, assessing expression of a child who has learned in 6 short years that not all adults are safe. No, Clara said. I don't have anywhere to be. The stranger nodded. Then he reached down and picked up the leather pouch from where Rudd had set it after counting it. Granger's man had kept it moving fast, like he wanted the exchange done before his employer changed his mind, and he handed it back to Clara. She stared at it. That's yours, she said. It was yours to begin with. He said it simply, without drama. Your husband's land ought to be worth more than $400 in debt. What's in that pouch is the difference. Clara's throat closed. She had not cried on that platform. She had stared down 30 men and a banker, and the whole silent, cowardly machinery of a town that had decided not to see her, and she had not cried. But standing in the dirt of Main Street, with this stranger handing her a leather pouch full of gold, and talking about Daniel's land like it still existed and still meant something. You knew my husband, she said. It came out rough, not quite a question. The stranger looked at her for a moment. Then he looked at Eli. Yes, ma'am, he said. I did. His name was Jack Callahan, and he did not explain himself further on the street. He bought them a meal at the only cafe in Iron Mesa that was still open. A narrow room that went quiet when they walked in and stayed quiet in that careful way that meant everyone was listening while pretending not to. Clara ate mechanically, watching him across the table, trying to piece together a man from the few surfaces he'd shown her. He ate like someone who had been on the trail and was aware of it, but wasn't going to let himself rush. He asked Eli what his name was, and when Eli told him, Jack nodded once and said, Good name, and went back to eating. Eli, who was usually shy with strangers, watched him with that serious, golden-eyed attention, and did not seem frightened. Clara waited until the food was gone before she asked, "How did you know Daniel?" Jack set down his coffee cup. His hands were broad, knuckled, the hands of a man who worked. "We served together," he said. 63rd Ohio, 3 years. Daniel had never talked about the war. Not once, not in 4 years of marriage. He had come back from it with something in his eyes that hadn't been there before, and a habit of waking at 3 in the morning and sitting on the porch until dawn. And Clara had learned to pour 2 cups of coffee and carry one out to him and not ask questions. "He never mentioned you," she said. She didn't say it unkindly. It was just true. "No," Jack said. He wouldn't have. He was quiet for a moment. "There's things from the war a man doesn't carry home. He keeps them separate. Doesn't want them touching the good parts of his life." Clara looked at him. "Were you one of the good parts, or one of the other kind?" Something shifted in Jack Callahan's face. Not pain exactly. Something older than pain. The residue of it. "Both, at different points," he said honestly. "He saved my life at Chickamauga. I never paid that back. I've been carrying it around for 15 years, and I thought—" He stopped. Started again. "I heard he died. I heard what was happening with his estate. I thought maybe this was how I settled the account." "You can't settle it by buying us like cattle," Clara said. "No," he agreed immediately. "I know that. That's not—" He ran a hand over his face. "Mrs. Whitmore, I don't own you. I don't think of it that way, and I never did. Whatever that piece of paper Granger's man is filing says, it's paper. You're free. You were always free." He met her eyes directly. "But if you need somewhere to go, if you need time to figure out what comes next, my ranch is 2 days north. I've got room, and you'd be a guest, not anything else. I swear that to you." Clara looked at him for a long time. She had become, in the past 4 months of widowhood, a student of men who offered things. The ones who had come to the farm after Daniel died. Some out of genuine kindness. Some out of calculation. Some who thought a widow alone was an opportunity of one kind or another. She had developed an instinct for the difference between a man's words and what lived behind them. Jack Callahan was not entirely readable. But what she could read, the directness, the lack of performance, the way he had said the difficult thing plainly instead of softening it into something easier, matched, so far as she could tell. She didn't trust him. Not yet. She wasn't sure she trusted anyone fully anymore. But she believed him, which was a different thing. And right now, it was enough. "I'll decide on the road," she said. "If you're still offering after 2 days of traveling with a 6-year-old who asks questions constantly, we can discuss arrangements at the other end." Something in Jack Callahan's face changed. It wasn't quite a smile either, but it was the closest thing she'd seen to one on him. "Fair enough," he said. They left Iron Mesa at first light. Clara took one look back from the seat of the wagon. She had insisted on driving her own wagon, and Jack had agreed to it without argument, which went some way toward her current working theory about him, and saw the main street of the town she had lived in for 4 years lying quiet under the early gray sky. The auction platform was still there, the cattle auction platform where she and her son had been priced and sold, and not one person with a beating heart had stood up to say that this was wrong until a stranger rode in on a tired horse. She turned forward on the seat and did not look back again. Eli was beside her, wrapped in his coat, already building toward questions. He managed to hold the first one until they were clear of town and the road had opened up into the scrub and rock of the Wyoming morning. "Mama," he said, Is he good or bad?" He was looking at Jack Callahan, riding ahead of them on the bay horse, not looking back. "I don't know yet," Clara said. "He talks quiet," Eli said, with the tone of a boy working through evidence. "He does. Bad men usually talk loud." He thought about it further. "Or they talk nice. The loud ones and the nice ones are the scary ones." Clara looked at her son. "Where did you learn that?" "Papa said it," Eli said simply. And then his face did something complicated and brief, the way a 6-year-old's face does when it runs up against something too big for it, and he looked back at the road. Clara reached over and put her arm around him, and he leaned against her, and ahead of them, Jack Callahan rode on without looking back, into the cold Wyoming morning, carrying whatever he was carrying in that silent, careful way of his. The first night on the trail, they made camp at a rock outcropping off the main road. Jack built the fire without being asked and without making a production of it. He produced food from his saddlebags that was considerably better than Clara had expected. Dried venison, hard biscuits, canned peaches that Eli regarded as a significant personal miracle, and said almost nothing while they ate. After Eli was asleep in the wagon under every blanket Clara owned, she sat across the fire from Jack Callahan, and the silence between them had the quality of something that had been waiting all day to happen. "Ask what you want to ask," he said, without looking up from the fire. "How did he die?" Jack said. "Daniel." Clara looked at the fire. "His horse threw him. October, coming back from town in the rain. He hit his head on a rock in the creek bed." She paused. "He never woke up." Jack was quiet. "I keep thinking," Clara said, "about the fact that he survived 3 years of war and came home whole, and then a wet road and a spooked horse." She stopped. "It doesn't make any sense." "No," Jack said. "It doesn't." "Did things make sense in the war? The ones who lived and the ones who didn't?" He was quiet for a long time. Long enough that she thought he wasn't going to answer. "No," he finally said. "Not for a single day of it." The fire snapped. Something moved in the dark beyond the horses, and Jack's hand went to the gun at his hip so fast and so naturally that she almost didn't register the motion, and then stopped when it turned out to be a rabbit, and came back to rest on his knee. Clara had noticed the speed of that, filed it away. "What do you run on your ranch?" she said, steering toward safer ground. "Cattle, mostly. Some horses. I've got 2 hands who've been with me since I started the place, and they're both good men." He looked up. "It's quiet up there. Some people don't take to quiet." "After today," Clara said, "quiet sounds like the best thing in the world." Something moved across his face in the firelight. Not quite the residue of pain expression from before. Something different, closer to understanding. "Yes," he said quietly. "I imagine it does." They rode for 2 days, and Clara watched Jack Callahan the way she had learned to watch everything since Daniel died. Carefully, from a slight angle, so the subject couldn't tell they were being observed. He rode well. He stopped before she had to ask when Eli needed a break. He watered both horses without being reminded. When a wheel on her wagon caught in a muddy rut on the second afternoon, and the horses couldn't pull it free, he got off his horse and put his shoulder to the wagon wheel and pushed in the mud without a word of complaint or commentary. He talked very little. When he did talk, he said what he meant and stopped. He and Eli had reached some kind of separate treaty that Clara wasn't entirely party to. She first noticed it on the afternoon of the first day, when Eli had been trailing alongside on the old gray pony she'd been allowing him to ride, and Jack had slowed the bay to walk beside him, and they had ridden like that for an hour while she drove the wagon ahead, catching fragments of the conversation on the wind. "Was that one? Red-tailed hawk. See the wing spread? And the color on the tail when it turns. Silence. Then, Papa used to know birds. And Jack had said something she couldn't hear, low and even, and Eli had nodded, and they had ridden on. Something about that exchange settled in Clara's chest in a complicated way that she didn't have words for and did not attempt to name. On the second evening, they could see the mountains to the north, and Jack pointed at a particular fold in the ridgeline. "That's the start of my land," he said. "Callahan Ridge. Ranch house is in the valley on the other side." Clara looked at where he was pointing. The mountains were red in the last of the sun. "It's beautiful," she said, before she could decide whether or not to say it. "Yes," Jack agreed, simply. "It is." And then they both watched the light change on the mountains for a moment, and neither of them said anything else. And in the quiet, Clara thought about Horace Granger, and his precise face, and his precise documents, and the way he had watched the auction from the side, with his hands folded. And something hardened in her that had nothing to do with the cold. She thought about the papers in the locked box in the bottom of the wagon. Daniel's papers, his land documents, his receipts, the letter from the bank, everything she had gathered in the frantic days before Granger's man came to the door, because something in her had known she needed to keep track, needed to document, needed to hold on to the proof of what her husband had actually owed and what he had actually paid, and when. She had not told Jack about those papers, not yet. She wasn't sure why. Instinct, maybe. The same instinct that had gotten her through the past 4 months. The bone-deep understanding that, in Iron Mesa, a woman alone was only as safe as the information she kept private. But tomorrow they would reach Callahan Ridge, and whatever came next was going to require trust from at least one direction. Clara looked at Jack Callahan on his tired horse against the red mountains, and she thought about a man who had ridden however far he had ridden, on whatever combination of honor and guilt had moved him, and walked into an auction he had no part in, and put $200 in gold on a rail without anyone asking him to. She thought about Daniel waking at 3 a.m. and sitting alone on the porch. She thought about what he used to say, quietly, on the rare occasions when the war came up at all, barely more than breath. "There were men I trusted with my life over there. Not many, but the ones I trusted all the way." Clara reached down and touched the edge of the locked box with one boot. Tomorrow, she thought. Tomorrow, she would decide. The mountains held their color for another few minutes and then let the dark have it. And the three of them moved on toward the ridge, carrying everything they brought and everything they hadn't yet said, into the last of the western evening. Callahan Ridge Ranch was not what Clara had imagined. She wasn't sure what she had imagined exactly. Some rough bachelor arrangement, she supposed. The kind of place a solitary man builds when he has no one to build it for. She had expected functional and cold, something that worked without being lived in. What she found was a house that had clearly been constructed with intention. 2 stories, solid timber, a wide front porch that caught the morning light from the east, a barn that was well maintained and smelled of clean hay, a garden bed along the south wall that had been started and then apparently abandoned somewhere around the beginning of summer, the way a garden looks when a person runs out of time rather than interest. 2 men came out of the barn when they heard the horses. Clara watched them register Jack's return, register the wagon, register her and Eli sitting on the seat, and exchange a glance that communicated an entire conversation in about a half-second. "Mrs. Whitmore," Jack said. "This is Tom Briggs and Cass Wheeler. They run the place when I'm away, which is more often than it should be." Tom Briggs was older, 60s maybe, gray-bearded and deliberate in the way he moved. He took off his hat. "Ma'am?" Cass Wheeler was younger and could not fully conceal the fact that he had questions. He settled for nodding and keeping them to himself, which Clara immediately appreciated. "Is there a room?" Jack asked Tom. "There are two," Tom said.
Was going to say something about that, actually.
"Good." Jack looked at Clara. "You and Eli take the upper rooms. I'll sleep in the barn until we figure out what the arrangement is going to be."
"You don't have to do that," Clara said.
"I know I don't have to." He said it without edge, just a fact. "It's your call, Mrs. Whitmore. Whatever you're comfortable with." She looked at him for a moment. Then she looked at Tom Briggs, who was watching her with the careful, respectful attention of a man who had seen enough of the world to know when a woman was taking stock of her situation.
"Clara," she said, "not Mrs. Whitmore. That takes too long."
Something in Tom's expression relaxed. Cass Wheeler almost smiled. Jack said nothing, but she caught the slight shift in his jaw that she was beginning to recognize as the equivalent, in Jack Callahan's vocabulary, of agreement. The first week passed in the way first weeks in unfamiliar places do, each day revealing another small geography of the life she'd stepped into. The ranch ran on a rhythm that she picked up quickly, because it wasn't unlike the rhythm of her own farm had been. Animals first, always. The horses, the cattle out in the east pasture, the two dogs that belonged to Cass, and had apparently decided that Eli was the most interesting development in their lives in years. Breakfast before sunrise. The day's work distributed without much ceremony. She cooked because she needed something to do with her hands, and also because Tom Briggs's biscuits were, in her honest assessment, catastrophic. The first morning she made a proper breakfast. Biscuits that actually rose, salt pork, eggs from the hens that lived in the small coop behind the barn. The expression on Cass Wheeler's face was so transparently grateful that Eli laughed out loud, which was the first time Clara had heard him laugh since before the auction. The sound hit her somewhere behind the sternum, sharp and sweet at once. She was drying dishes that evening when Jack came to the kitchen doorway. He stopped there rather than coming in, which she'd noticed was his habit. He did not enter spaces without a kind of implicit permission, as if he were constitutionally aware of the difference between his house and her temporary occupancy of it. "He seems better today," Jack said, with a slight nod toward the sound of Eli and the dogs audible from somewhere outside.
"Yes," she kept drying. "He does."
A pause. Then, "You found the papers." Clara's hands stopped. She turned. Jack was leaning against the doorframe with his arms crossed and his expression the usual careful neutral, but his eyes were direct in a way that told her he hadn't been guessing. "What papers?" she said. It came out flatter than a question. "The ones in the locked box in the bottom of the wagon," Jack said. "The ones you've been deciding whether to tell me about since the first night on the trail." The silence stretched for several seconds. "You went through my wagon?" Clara said. "No." He said it quietly, but without hesitation. "Daniel told me about them. Before he died." The air in the kitchen changed. Clara set the dish down on the counter very deliberately. "Daniel told you," she said. "My husband, who you hadn't seen in 15 years, told you about papers in a locked box." "He wrote to me," Jack said, 8 months ago, about 6 weeks before the accident." "He wrote to you." He'd been getting visits from Granger's men, questions about the land, the deed, the property boundaries. He said it didn't feel right. He said— Jack paused, and something moved across his face. He said if anything happened to him, somebody needed to know. Somebody who wasn't in Granger's pocket. Clara stared at him. The dish towel was still in her hands. She was gripping it without being aware of it. "He knew something might happen to him," she said. "He was worried. He said he might be wrong. He said he hoped he was wrong." Jack met her eyes. He wasn't wrong. The room was very quiet. Outside, she could hear Eli calling to the dogs, his voice bright and ordinary and 6 years old. And the contrast between that sound and what was happening inside her at this moment was so sharp it was almost physical. "He wrote to you and not to me," she said. "He didn't want to frighten you." "He should have frightened me." Her voice came out harder than she intended. "He should have told me. I had a right to know what we were in. I was his wife." She stopped, breathed. "I am his wife." Jack let the silence sit for a moment, the way she was beginning to understand he did. Not from discomfort with it, but from respect for it. Letting a thing land before he spoke again. "Yes," he said. "He should have told you. I can't argue that." "But you came anyway." "I came anyway." "And the money?" "I've had that money set aside for 4 years," Jack said, "since I got the first letter. When Daniel said there might be trouble, I started keeping it liquid, just in case." His jaw tightened slightly. "When I got the news he was gone, I knew." Clara looked at him for a long time. She was doing the things she'd taught herself, reading the difference between a man's words and what was behind them. Reading Jack Callahan. "You could have told me this on the road," she said. "Yes." "Why didn't you?" He was quiet for a moment. "Because you didn't trust me yet. And you shouldn't have. You'd just watched an entire town fail you. You didn't need another stranger coming at you with claims about knowing your husband, and having letters, and some story that could have been anything." He met her eyes. "I needed you to see the ranch first. To see Tom and Cass. To see what kind of operation this actually is, before you had to decide whether any of this was real." Clara thought about the 2 days on the road, the wheel in the mud, the hawk with the red tail, Eli and Jack riding side by side in a silence that wasn't uncomfortable. "Show me the letters," she said. They were 6 letters in total, each one in Daniel's handwriting. The cramped, slightly leftward slant she had spent 4 years reading across the breakfast table. Seeing it now, in Jack Callahan's kitchen, in a context she had never imagined, produced a feeling she couldn't name. A dissonance. Like hearing music from a room you thought was empty. She read every word. The first 3 were careful, practical. Daniel describing the visits from Granger's men, the questions about the deed, a property survey that had been conducted without his knowledge along the southern boundary, the questions about water rights, the careful way Granger himself had started appearing at the feed store, at the church social, in places where a banker didn't ordinarily have business, always with a reason, always pleasant, always circling. The 4th letter was different. "I found something in the county records that Granger doesn't know I found. The original land grant for the valley, the one that covers the South Range, the creek access, everything he's been sniffing around. It was issued to my grandfather in 1847. Granger's been buying up claims that border it, and I think he's been filing amended surveys that chip away at the boundaries. Piece by piece, quiet as anything. Jack, there's water under that land. There's been rumors of it for years, but I think it's real. I think that's what he wants. Not the land, the water." Clara read that paragraph twice. The water. She thought about the creek that ran along the southern property line. She thought about the dry summer 3 years ago, when every ranch for 50 miles had been hauling water, and how their creek had never stopped running. She had noticed it and been grateful, and not thought about it further. She thought about Horace Granger and his precise face, and the way he had watched the auction from the side. Not the land, the water. "He knew," she said, very quietly. She wasn't talking to Jack. She was talking to Daniel, to the cramped leftward handwriting, to the husband who had known something was wrong and had written letters in secret instead of telling her, and who was dead now in a creek bed in the rain, and who was never going to know how right he'd been. Clara. Jack's voice was careful. She looked up. "The 5th letter," he said. She looked down, turned the page. "Jack, I don't think it was a coincidence. The survey team was on my land 3 days before Rudd showed up about the loan. The loan I took for $200 2 years ago and have been paying down monthly. I have every receipt. The amount on the paper Rudd brought was not the amount I owe. I've been over my records 4 times. Someone changed it. I don't know when or how, but the numbers don't match, and I think that's the point. The receipts." Clara looked up at Jack again. Her pulse was doing something irregular. "The locked box," she said. "Daniel told me what was in it," Jack said. "He said if anything happened to him, you'd have his records. He said keep them safe and don't let Granger know you have them." "He told you all of that and didn't tell me?" "Clara, I know." She held up one hand. "I know why. It doesn't make it less—" She stopped, pressed the letters flat on the table with both palms, collected herself the way she had learned to collect herself over the past 4 months, through practice and necessity and the particular discipline of being a woman alone who couldn't afford to be undone in front of people who were waiting for her to come apart. "It doesn't matter. What matters now is what we do with this." Jack nodded. That was all. Just the nod. And something about that, the lack of commentary, the lack of reassurance, the simple acknowledgement that she was right and they should proceed, steadied her more than anything else could have. "The 6th letter," she said. He was quiet. She looked at the papers. There were only 5. "Jack." "He was going to write a 6th letter," Jack said. "He said in the 5th one that he had more to tell me, and he'd write again in a week." A pause. "I never got another letter." The ranch settled into routine after that, but underneath the routine, everything had changed. They knew it, both of them, in the way people know when a conversation has moved something permanent. Clara unlocked the box. She spread Daniel's records on the kitchen table one morning while Eli was out with Cass checking fences, and she and Jack went through them piece by piece, receipt by receipt, entry by entry in Daniel's careful ledger. The records told a clear story. Daniel had borrowed $200 from Granger's bank in March of 1878. He had made 11 monthly payments of $15 each. The ledger showed every one, with dates and amounts and a brief notation of the clerk who had accepted it. Total paid, $165. Remaining balance, by any honest calculation, $35 and accrued interest at the rate specified in the original loan document. Not $412. "He didn't just inflate the number," Clara said. She was reading the bank's loan document alongside Daniel's ledger, running a finger down the columns. "He changed the interest rate. Look, Daniel's copy says 5% annual. The document Rudd brought me says 12%, compounded monthly." She looked up. "That's not a clerical error. Someone went into the original agreement and changed the terms after Daniel signed it." Jack was standing beside her, close enough to read the documents over her shoulder. She could feel the tension in him, the controlled, practical quality of it, like a spring under pressure. "He's done this before," Jack said quietly. She looked at him. "There was a rancher named Pearson, North Valley, about 18 months ago," Jack said. "Lost his property to Granger in a debt settlement. The hands talked. People said the numbers never made sense, but nobody could prove anything, and Pearson couldn't afford a lawyer." His jaw set. "And before that, the Alderman family. Same thing. Granger started circling their water access, and 6 months later, They were gone. "Why hasn't anyone stopped him?" Clara said. "Because he owns the sheriff," Jack said flatly. "And the circuit judge comes through once every 2 months. And by the time he gets here, the land is already transferred, and the paper trail is complicated enough that proving fraud would take a lawyer about 6 months of work, and nobody Granger has targeted has had 6 months, or a lawyer." Clara looked back at the documents in front of her, at Daniel's handwriting, at the 11 careful entries in the ledger, at $15, $15, $15, 11 times over, as faithful and regular as a man could be. "I have 6 months," she said, "and I have the proof." Jack looked at her, really looked at her, in the way he rarely did, the careful neutral stripped away for just a moment. "Yes," he said, "you do." Tom Briggs found out that same evening. He came in for supper and found the documents spread across the table, and Clara explaining the situation to Jack in a voice that was steady and precise, and he listened without interrupting until she finished. Then he sat down in his chair at the end of the table and said nothing for so long that Cass, who'd come in behind him, started to look worried. "Granger," Tom finally said. The word came out like something he'd been chewing on. "You know him?" Clara asked. "Know of him." Tom's eyes had gone to some distance. "There was a woman named Ruth Heller 3 years back. Had a small claim northeast of Iron Mesa. Granger put a lien on it for a debt her dead husband had supposedly left. She had receipts, too." He stopped. "What happened to her?" Clara said. Tom's eyes came back to the table, to the documents. "Her barn burned down," he said. 3 days after she told Granger she was going to contest the lien. The kitchen went very quiet. Cass was looking at the door, then at Clara. "Ma'am?" Cass said. He was young and earnest, and had until this moment seemed primarily interested in biscuits and his dogs. But the look on his face now was something older than his years. "Are you going to fight him?" Clara thought about the platform, the gabble, the 30 silent faces looking away, the cold water feeling that had moved through her from the top down. She thought about Daniel's handwriting, $15, 11 times. An honest man keeping an honest account, right up until someone decided that honesty was an obstacle. "Yes," she said. Cass nodded once. Something in his bearing shifted, settled, like a decision made. "Good," he said. The nights at Callahan Ridge had a particular quality that Clara hadn't experienced since before Daniel died. A quality of actual quiet. Not the exhausted silence of a woman alone running a farm on hollow bones, but something more like rest. Real rest. The sound of the wind in the grass, the horses moving in the barn, Eli's breathing from the next room, steady and slow. She was not always able to use that quiet for sleeping. There were nights when her mind ran the numbers again, or revisited the platform, or found its way to Daniel's 5th letter and the week that had gone by after it without a 6th one. One of those nights, she came downstairs to find Jack already at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee and the particular stillness of a man who had also given up on sleep. He looked up when she came in. Didn't seem surprised. Just moved the coffee pot to the front of the stove where she could reach it. She poured a cup and sat across from him, and they were quiet for a little while. "Do you dream about the war?" she asked. It came out before she had fully decided to ask it. Jack looked at the cup in his hands. "Sometimes." "Daniel used to sit on the porch at night," she said, "when it was bad. He never told me what he was thinking about." "He told me once," Jack said. "In a letter. The first letter, years ago. He said the worst part wasn't the dying. It was the sound of men calling out for people who weren't there. Calling for their mothers, their wives." He was quiet a moment. "He said he came home to you, and for a long time that was the only thing that made the sounds stop." Clara's throat closed. She sat with that for a long moment. Outside the window, the dark was full and complete. The kind of dark you only got far from town. "He was a good man," she finally said. "The best I knew," Jack said, simply, without sentimentality. Just a fact stated by someone who had been in a position to know. Clara looked at him across the table. At the worn face, the honest eyes, the hands wrapped around the coffee cup. "Jack," she said, "when this is over, when we go back to Iron Mesa and we take those documents to the circuit judge, what happens to you?" He looked at her steadily. "What do you mean?" "I mean, you've put yourself in the middle of a fight with a man who apparently burns barns," she said. "You've sheltered the woman he was trying to ruin. You've helped me build a case against him." She held his gaze. "What does that cost you?" Something shifted in Jack Callahan's face. He looked down at his cup, back up. "Daniel saved my life," he said. "Standing up for what he left behind, that's not a cost. That's just what a man does." "But after," she pressed quietly, "when it's settled, when Granger's been dealt with and Eli and I have somewhere to go, what then?" The silence stretched between them, not uncomfortable. Something in it had weight. "I hadn't thought past it," Jack said at last. And the way he said it, honest, slightly unguarded, more candid than was typical for him, told her that was either entirely true or the closest he was willing to come to what was actually true. She nodded and didn't push further. She got up and poured the rest of her coffee out and set the cup in the basin. "Good night, Jack," she said. "Good night, Clara." She was at the bottom of the stairs when he spoke again, low enough that she almost didn't catch it. "I've thought past it," he said. "I just didn't want to say so yet." She paused on the first step, her hand on the rail. She didn't turn around. After a moment, she continued up the stairs, and the house settled back into its nighttime quiet, and in the kitchen below, Jack Callahan sat with his cold coffee and the weight of everything that was coming. While somewhere in Iron Mesa, Horace Granger was beginning to understand that his problem had not gone away. It had gone north. And it had started keeping records. The writer came on a Tuesday. Clara was in the garden, the abandoned one she'd been quietly resurrecting along the south wall, coaxing it back from its summer neglect, when she heard the dogs go still. Not the excited barking they did when Cass came back from the pasture, or when a rabbit crossed the yard. Silence. The particular silence of dogs that have picked up something they don't know what to make of yet. She stood up and looked toward the road. One horse, moving at a pace that was just slightly too deliberate to be casual. The rider was lean, wide-hatted, and scanning the property the way a man scans a property when he's building a picture of it, rather than simply passing through. Jack came out of the barn before she had time to do anything. He stood in the yard and waited, and his stillness was the same stillness she'd seen on the street in Iron Mesa. That absolute, unhurried quality that was not passivity, but its precise opposite. The rider pulled up 10 yards short of the fence. "Looking for Jack Callahan." "You found him," Jack said. "Mr. Granger sends his compliments," the rider said. He had the flat tone of a man reciting a message he'd been paid to deliver, and didn't particularly believe in. "He says the woman and the child ought to come back to Iron Mesa. Says there's still a matter of outstanding legal process that needs settling." Clara felt the cold come back. The old cold. The auction platform cold, moving through her from the top down. Jack looked at the rider for a moment. "You tell Mr. Granger the legal process was settled on the day I paid $200 in gold in front of 30 witnesses on Main Street." Mr. Granger says that transaction may not have been properly— You tell him what I said, Jack said, quietly. Word for word. The writer looked at Jack for a long moment. Then his eyes moved to Clara, standing at the garden wall with dirt on her hands, and something shifted in his expression. Not malice exactly, more like the recalibration of a man who has arrived expecting one situation and found another. He turned his horse without another word and rode back the way he'd come. The dogs watched him go. That wasn't a messenger, Tom Briggs said from the porch behind them. Clara turned. She hadn't heard him come out. Tom was watching the road with his arms crossed, and the expression of a man whose gut was telling him something his mouth hadn't put into words yet. No, Jack said. That was a survey. 3 days of quiet followed. The kind of quiet that has a texture to it, that you brush up against every time you cross a room or step out the door. Cass started sleeping with his rifle within reach. Tom took to walking the property line at dusk without being asked. Jack said nothing about any of it, but Clara noticed that he positioned himself differently. Always with a sight line to the road, always with his back to something solid. She told herself to focus on the documents. She had been organizing Daniel's records into a coherent sequence. A paper argument, she thought of it. The kind a lawyer could pick up and follow without any prior knowledge of the situation. She had a clear hand and a precise mind, and the work gave her something to do with the anger that had nowhere else to go. Eli watched her sometimes from across the table, chin in his hand, sensing the atmosphere in the way children do, picking up the frequency of adult tension without being told what was causing it. "Are the bad men coming?" he asked one evening. Just like that, without preamble, the way children ask the things adults spend energy not asking. Clara looked up from the papers. She could have deflected. She had become skilled at deflection since Daniel died, shielding Eli from the worst of things, while keeping him informed enough that he didn't have to fear the unknown. But looking at his face now, at those dark, gold-flecked eyes that saw more than a 6-year-old should have to see, she decided he'd earned something closer to the truth. "Some men from town might come," she said, "because they want something that isn't theirs." "The banker man?" "Yes." Eli thought about this seriously. "Does Jack know?" "Jack knows." The boy nodded. Something in him settled. "Okay," he said, and went back to the picture he'd been drawing. Horses, she thought. The rough, bold lines of a child who draws what he loves. Clara looked down at the documents and her throat tightened. The circuit judge, a man named Harlan Foster out of Cheyenne, was due in Iron Mesa in 6 weeks. Clara had calculated it from the county schedule she'd found in Daniel's papers. 6 weeks was enough time if everything went right. If the documents arrived intact. If the judge was honest. If Granger hadn't already made arrangements to manage what the judge saw and heard when he got there. 3 large ifs. She was laying out the problems to Jack that evening, not asking for solutions, just thinking aloud, working through the architecture of what they were up against, when he said something that stopped her mid-sentence. "There's a land attorney in Laramie named Holt," he said. "Nathan Holt. He took down a county commissioner 2 years ago on a property fraud case very similar to this one. Won it clean." He looked at her across the table. "I wrote to him last week." Clara stared at him. "You wrote to him last week?" "The day after we went through Daniel's records." "Without telling me." He met her eyes steadily. "I was going to tell you when I heard back. I didn't want to give you another thing to think about until I knew if it was real." She looked at him for a long moment. There was a difference, she was learning, between a man who acted without consulting her because he thought her opinion didn't matter, and a man who acted without consulting her because he was trying to protect her from disappointment. One was dismissal. The other was something more complicated. Still not right, still presumptuous, but coming from an entirely different place. "Next time," she said, "you tell me first." "Yes," he said. No argument, no qualification. She nodded. "What did he say?" "Holt." "He's coming up the week before Foster arrives. He wants to see the original documents in person." Jack paused. "He says, if Daniel's records are what you describe, we have a strong case. Fraud. Falsification of a legal document. Potentially a pattern if we can document Pearson and the Alderman family as well."
"Tom said Ruth Heller had receipts too," Clara said, "before her barn burned."
"Tom is going to write down what he knows about Heller," Jack said. "It's not proof, but it's testimony. It establishes pattern." Clara sat with this for a moment, running the new information against what she already knew, adjusting the architecture in her head.
"Granger is going to find out Holt is coming," she said.
"Yes."
"He'll have time to prepare."
"He'll have time to be frightened," Jack corrected quietly. "That's different. Frightened men make mistakes." Clara thought about the rider who would come on Tuesday, the deliberate pace, the scanning eyes.
"He's already frightened," she said. "That rider wasn't here to deliver a message. He was here to see how well we were set up."
"Yes," Jack said. "And now he knows." The night it happened was a Thursday, 3 weeks after the rider came. The sound that woke Clara was not a gunshot. It was the dogs, both of them at once, the pitched, urgent sound that was entirely different from anything they'd produced before. And under it, the heavier sound of hooves. Multiple horses, moving fast and not trying to hide it. She was out of bed before she was fully awake, pulling her boots on in the dark, lifting Eli from his cot before his eyes were open.
"Quiet," she whispered against his hair. "Quiet, baby. Come with me. Stay low."
He was good. He had always been good in crisis, her son. Some deep-grained instinct toward stillness when stillness was needed, that she recognized as Daniel's blood in him. She got them both to the floor, away from the window, and heard the voices below. 3 men outside, she counted by the voices, maybe 4. They hadn't come to the door yet. They were in the yard, and one of them was talking. Not shouting, not the confrontational volume of men who wanted to fight, but something lower and more purposeful that was somehow worse. Then Jack's voice, carrying from the direction of the barn, where he'd been sleeping, clear and unhurried in the dark. "You're on private property." "Come on out, Callahan." A different voice, rougher. "Nobody needs to get hurt tonight. We're just here for the woman and the boy. Nobody on this property is going anywhere with you." "That's not your call to make, friend." "It is tonight," Jack said, "and I'm not your friend." A pause. Then, "There are 4 of us." "I can count," Jack said. "How many of you want to go home tonight?" Clara's heart was hammering. She held Eli closer and pressed her back against the wall and thought. Rapidly, clearly, in the controlled way the terror sometimes produces when a person cannot afford to let it take over. About the shotgun on the rack at the top of the stairs. About the distance between her and it. About Eli, who was shaking slightly but still completely silent. Downstairs, a door opened. Tom Briggs's measured step on the floorboards. Then Cass from somewhere outside. He must have been in the bunkhouse. He must have heard the dogs. His voice adding to the configuration below. "You heard him. Move on." A silence that lasted long enough to be a decision. Then the shot. It came from outside, and it came from the left, and it was not aimed at anything it hit, because Clara heard it go wide and high, and she understood suddenly, heart seizing, that it was not a shot to hit. It was a shot to start something. What followed was not a battle in any orderly sense. It was the chaos of men in the dark, making rapid decisions about their own survival. Gunfire from at least 3 directions, boots on the porch stairs, Tom's voice calling something to Cass, and Jack Callahan's voice nowhere. Silent, which frightened her more than anything else, because she didn't know what silent meant. She found out 20 seconds later, when the sound moved away from the house. All of it, the shots, the shouting, the hooves, and then came back in a different configuration, closer to the road, and then receded. Then, quiet. The dogs had stopped. Eli's breathing was against her neck, rapid and warm. He hadn't made a sound. Clara sat in the dark with her son pressed against her and counted her own heartbeats, and waited. Jack's voice came from the base of the stairs. "Clara!" She exhaled. "Here! We're here!" "Stay up there until I call you down." She stayed. When she came downstairs 10 minutes later, the kitchen lamp was lit, and Tom had a cloth pressed against his left forearm. Grazed, not deep, but producing enough blood to take seriously. And Cass was sitting at the table looking like a man who had been in a fight and was in the process of understanding that he had come out of it. Jack was at the window, his back to the room. "How many came?" Clara said. "4," Jack said, without turning. 2 rode off toward the south road. 1 went down in the yard. Not dead, Cass checked. He was well enough to walk. He walked. He paused. "The 4th one I had a conversation with." Something in the way he said "conversation" made Tom glance up from his arm. "What kind of conversation?" Clara asked. Jack turned then. His face was the composed face, the neutral face, but underneath it was something with more edge than she'd seen on him before. Not anger, exactly. Something more contained than anger. Something that had been compressed. "The kind where he told me who sent them and what they were supposed to bring back," Jack said. "And then I let him go." "Granger sent them." Granger's name wasn't used, but the description of what they were to retrieve was specific enough that it could only have come from someone who knew the contents of Daniel's records. Word for word. His jaw set. Which means Granger knows about the documents. He knows what you have. Clara went very still. "How?" "That rider, 3 weeks back," Tom said quietly. He was wrapping his arm with a strip of cloth. "He got close enough to the house." "He didn't get inside," Cass said. "He didn't need to get inside," Clara said. She was thinking through it, rapidly, the way she'd been thinking through the document evidence. "He talked to someone in town. Someone who knew what Daniel kept. Someone who knew him." She stopped. A cold thought moved through her. Rudd. Granger's man Rudd had access to Daniel's bank file. Daniel would have had to show the bank documentation when he took the loan. Jack looked at her. Rudd would have seen the ledger. He would have known Daniel kept records. He would have known what kind of records. She felt the cold sharpen into something more precise. But he doesn't know what's in them, not specifically. What they described tonight, what they were supposed to bring back. Was it the ledger? "All of the papers," Jack said. "The whole box." Clara crossed to the table, sat down. Her hands were steady, and that surprised her, somewhere below the surface of her mind, because everything else was moving fast and sharp and certain. "He needs the documents," she said. "If he can take them before Holt gets here, before the judge arrives, he controls the narrative. Without the original receipts, without Daniel's ledger, it's my word against a banker's legal filing." She looked up at Jack. "He's not trying to stop us. He's trying to erase us." The room was quiet except for Tom's careful, methodical breathing as he finished wrapping his arm. Eli appeared at the base of the stairs. He'd come down silently and stood now in the kitchen doorway in his nightshirt, with his hair loose and his dark gold eyes moving around the room, and finally, settling on Tom's bandaged arm.
"Are you hurt bad?"
he asked Tom. His voice was small, but steady. "I'm all right, son," Tom said. "Just a scratch." Eli looked at Jack next.
"Did we win?"
Jack looked at the boy for a long moment. Something moved in his face that Clara had seen before, on the trail, when Eli and he had ridden side by side through the afternoon. Something that was still trying to find its name. "Tonight we did," Jack said. Eli absorbed this with a 6-year-old's pragmatic gravity.
"Will they come back?"
The room waited. "Yes," Jack said. He had stopped lying to the boy in the small protective ways adults usually did. Clara had noticed this and decided it was right.
"But they won't find what they're looking for."
Eli looked at his mother, then back at Jack.
"Because you'll stop them?"
"Because we'll stop them," Jack said. "All of us." Tom raised his bandaged arm slightly, a gesture that managed to be both wry and completely sincere. Cass, at the table, nodded once with the quiet conviction of a man who has made a decision and intends to stand by it. Eli nodded back, as if a contract had been formalized in a language his 6-year-old self fully understood. Then he came to Clara, and she pulled him into her lap, and his weight against her was the most grounding thing she had felt all night. Before dawn, Jack moved the documents. Clara had already thought of this, had been thinking of it since the moment Jack said they were looking for the whole box. But Jack had thought of it simultaneously, which she was beginning to understand was a pattern between them. A convergence of the same practical, clear-eyed reasoning that had probably served them both well in different situations and different kinds of danger. He took the locked box to the barn and pulled up a section of floorboard that Tom knew about and nobody else did. And Clara wrapped Daniel's records in oilcloth, and they went down into that space, and the board went back over them, and straw went over the board. "If something happens to me," Clara said, while they were in the barn and the dark was still complete outside, and Eli was back upstairs asleep. "Tom and Cass know where they are. And Holt is already coming. He has the outline in the letter you sent him." "It's not enough on its own, but combined with what Pearson's hands know and what Tom can say about Heller, nothing is going to happen to you," Jack said. "Jack, Clara." He said her name the way he said most things, once, clearly, without excess. And when she looked at him, his expression in the barn light was stripped of the usual careful composure, the way a face looks at 4 a.m, when a person has stopped performing for the day, and there's nothing left between you and what they actually are. "I understand why you're planning for it. I understand it's practical. But I am telling you that nothing is going to happen to you or to Eli. Not while I'm drawing breath. I am not going to let—" He stopped, started again. "Daniel trusted me with the most important thing in his life. That was not a small trust. I will not fail it." The barn was quiet. One of the horses shifted in its stall. Clara looked at Jack Callahan for a long time, at the face that had ridden into Iron Mesa on a tired horse and changed the trajectory of everything. At the eyes that had never once in all the weeks she'd known him been dishonest with her about anything. "You're not doing this for Daniel anymore," she said. It was not an accusation. It was just a thing she knew. He held her gaze and said nothing, and the silence said everything he wasn't ready yet to say. The letter from Nathan Holt arrived 2 days later. He would be in Iron Mesa in 4 weeks. He had reviewed the outline Jack had sent him, and he was confident. The language of the letter was professional and precise, a lawyer's language, measured and careful. But underneath it, Clara could read the appetite of a man who recognized a real case when he saw one. She read it twice, and then folded it carefully and put it in the inside pocket of her coat, closest to her chest. That evening, she stood on the front porch as the sun dropped behind the ridge and painted everything gold and red. And she thought about Daniel sitting on the porch at home at 3 in the morning, drinking his coffee and keeping the war separate from the good parts of his life. She thought about him writing those letters to a man he hadn't seen in 15 years, because something in him knew, with the bone-deep instinct of a man who had survived 3 years of people trying to kill him, that the danger was real. She thought about the 6th letter that had never come. She had been avoiding that thought because it had edges, and she knew what it meant if she let herself fully arrive at it. But standing on the porch in the last of the evening light, with the documents safe under the barn floor, and a lawyer 4 weeks out, and the riders from 2 nights ago retreated to wherever Granger had sent them from, she finally let herself think it. Daniel might not have fallen from his horse. The creek bed, the wet road, the spooked horse. All of it possible. All of it happening every week somewhere in Wyoming to men who rode in the rain. Completely possible. Completely ordinary. Or it was something else. Something arranged by a man who needed Daniel Whitmore off his land, and who had demonstrated, in the matter of Ruth Heller's barn, that obstacles could be removed. Clara did not have proof of this. She might never have proof of this. It lived in the space between what she knew and what she could demonstrate, and a lawyer like Holt would tell her plainly that feelings were not evidence. But she knew. She knew the way you know things that live in your body before your mind has finished processing them. Jack came to stand beside her. He didn't say anything. He just stood there, which was one of the things she had come to understand about him, that he had an instinct for when a person needed company and when they needed to be left alone. And tonight he had gotten it exactly right. And the simple fact of him standing there in the cooling air without demanding anything from her was more comfort than most people managed with words. "Jack," she said. I think Granger killed him." The silence that followed was not a surprised silence. It was the silence of a man who had been sitting with the same thought for weeks and hadn't said it aloud because he was waiting for her to arrive at it in her own time. "I think so too," he said quietly. The sun finished setting, and somewhere south of the ridge, in the town of Iron Mesa, Horace Granger was sitting behind his banker's desk and beginning to understand that what he had set in motion was not going to end the way he had planned. The woman had not broken, the cowboy had not run, and the ground was shifting in ways that his precise, careful, ruthless calculations had entirely failed to account for. The reckoning was coming. He just didn't know yet what shape it would wear when it arrived. Nathan Holt was not what Clara had expected. She had built a picture of him from the letter, measured, professional, careful, and translated that into someone older, gray-suited, the kind of man who carried authority in his bearing the way a judge carries a gavel. What stepped off the stage from Cheyenne was a man of maybe 40, lean and sharp-eyed, with a travel coat that had seen hard use, and the leather satchel that he held like it contained something worth protecting. Which it did. She found that out within the first 10 minutes. He shook her hand before he shook Jack's. She noticed that. "Mrs. Whitmore," he said, "I've read everything Mr. Callahan sent me. I need to see the original documents today, if possible. Not copies, the originals." His eyes were the kind that moved fast and settled hard. "Judge Foster arrives in 4 days. We do not have room for error." "You'll have them within the hour," Clara said. Something in Holt's expression shifted. A small recalibration, the kind a man makes when he arrives expecting to manage someone and finds instead that no management is required. "Good," he said simply. They rode to the ranch in near silence, and Clara spent the ride watching Holt the way she watched everyone now, looking for the difference between the surface and what moved beneath it. What she found was a man who was not performing competence. He had it, and he knew it, and he didn't feel the need to demonstrate it in advance. That was enough for her. Holt spent 3 hours with Daniel's documents at the kitchen table. He did not speak during those 3 hours, except to occasionally ask Clara a precise question: the date of a specific payment, the name of the clerk Daniel had noted in the ledger, whether she knew if any of the original survey markers on the south boundary were still standing. She answered each one immediately and exactly. He wrote notes in a compact hand on a legal pad he'd brought from the satchel. Jack stood in the kitchen doorway and watched without interfering. Tom brought coffee at one point, and Holt accepted it without looking up. At the end of the 3 hours, Holt sat back and looked at Clara across the table with those fast, settling eyes, and said, "This is the cleanest case of documented loan fraud I have seen in 14 years of practice." The room went very quiet. The original interest rate in Daniel's signed copy is 5% annual, Holt continued. The figure submitted to the county clerk for the lien is 12% compounded monthly. That is not a discrepancy. That is not an error. That is falsification of a legal instrument. He tapped Daniel's ledger. The payment receipts are dated, witnessed, and sequential. The math is unambiguous. Daniel Whitmore owed $35 at the time of his death, not $412. "Can you prove he changed the document?" Jack said from the doorway. "Granger, specifically." "I don't need to prove he changed it himself," Holt said. "I need to prove the document was changed. The changed document was filed by Granger's bank under Granger's authority. Under Wyoming statute, that makes him legally responsible for the fraud, regardless of who held the pen." He paused. "But I would very much like to know who held the pen." "Rudd," Clara said. "His man Rudd handles all the bank's paperwork. Every receipt Daniel ever brought in, Rudd was the clerk who processed it." Holt made a note. "Is Rudd still in Iron Mesa?" "As far as I know." "Good." Another note. "Now, the Pearson matter, and the Heller woman. Tell me everything you know about those." They talked for another 2 hours. Tom came in and told what he knew about Ruth Heller, which wasn't much, but was precisely what it was. No embellishment, no guessing, just the facts as he'd heard them from people who'd been there. Holt wrote it down and said it was useful without telling them exactly how. It was past supper when Holt finally closed his satchel. He looked at Clara and said, 4 days. I need you in Iron Mesa before Foster arrives. You and Callahan both. And these documents." He tapped the satchel. "I'll make copies tonight and tomorrow. 2 sets. You hold one, I hold one. If anything happens to either set—" "Nothing will happen to them," Jack said. Holt looked at Jack with the calm assessment of a man who takes risks seriously. "Mr. Callahan, Granger has already sent hired men to this property once. He will know, or will know soon, that I am here. When a man like Granger gets desperate, he does not get cautious. He gets dangerous." A pause. "I need you to understand that." "I understand it better than you do," Jack said. "I was here for the riders." Holt held his gaze for a moment, then nodded. 4 days, he said again. "Don't be late." The second day after Holt left for Iron Mesa, Rudd came. Not with riders this time, alone, on a gray horse, mid-morning, making no attempt at concealment. He rode to the front gate and stopped and called out Jack's name, which told Clara several things simultaneously. That Granger had sent him, that Granger wanted this to look like a legitimate errand, and that Granger was either very confident or very frightened. She and Jack both came to the porch. Rudd looked worse than he had the last time she'd seen him, the morning he'd brought the papers to her door. Something had gone out of the flat professional expression, replaced by something that could have been exhaustion, or could have been the particular look of a man who has been carrying a weight he didn't agree to carry. "Mrs. Whitmore," he said. He didn't look at Jack. His eyes were on her. "Mr. Granger wants to settle this privately." Clara crossed her arms. "There's nothing to settle privately. He's prepared to make restitution." Rudd's jaw tightened. "The full amount paid to date, plus 20%. For the inconvenience." He said the last word like it tasted wrong. "He asks only that you withdraw the attorney and let the legal matter rest." Clara looked at Rudd, really looked at him, and saw something she hadn't expected to find. The flat expression was not flat all the way down. There was something underneath it, something that had been put under pressure and was showing the first hairline cracks. "Rudd," she said, "did you change the document?" His whole body went still. "The interest rate," she said, "on Daniel's loan agreement. Did Granger tell you to change it, or did you do it on your own?" "Mrs. Whitmore, I am not here to—" "I'm not asking for a court," she said. "I'm asking you, because you're standing here alone and Granger isn't, which means either he trusts you completely or he's already decided you're expendable." She paused. "Which is it?" The color left Rudd's face slowly, the way color leaves a face when a truth lands squarely on it. He looked at Jack, then back at Clara, then at his hands on the saddle horn. "He told me it was a rounding adjustment," Rudd said. His voice had lost all its professional flatness. What was underneath it was just a man, tired and scared and not as sure as he'd been about what he was part of. He said the numbers had been miscalculated at signing and he was correcting them. I filed what he put in front of me. "And the Pearson lien," Jack said, "was that a rounding adjustment too?" The silence that followed was answer enough. "Rudd," Clara said, "there is a lawyer named Holt in Iron Mesa right now preparing to present this case to Judge Foster in 3 days. If you go back to Granger and tell him the offer was refused, Granger will know the case is proceeding. And when it does, and it will, the first person Foster is going to want to talk to is the bank clerk who processed the fraudulent filings." She let that sit for a moment. "If you walk into that courthouse voluntarily, before you're subpoenaed, and you tell the truth about what you were told to file and when, that is a very different position than being dragged in as a defendant." Rudd stared at her. His horse shifted beneath him. "He'll destroy me," Rudd said. It came out low, almost not quite a whisper. "He's already planning to," Clara said. "You know that. That's why you look the way you look right now." Another silence. Longer this time. "I have a wife," Rudd said. "2 children." "I have a son," Clara said. "Daniel had a son. He's 6 years old, and he watched his mother stand on the cattle platform while men put prices on her." Her voice stayed level. It cost her. "I am not asking you to be brave, Mr. Rudd. I am asking you to be honest. There's a difference." Rudd looked at her for a long time. Then he turned his horse around and rode back toward the road. "He's going to Granger," Jack said. "Maybe," Clara said. "Or maybe he's going home to tell his wife something he should have told her a long time ago." They left for Iron Mesa the next morning, 2 days before Foster was due, because Jack decided the road was safer than waiting, and Clara agreed without needing the reasoning explained. Tom and Cass stayed at the ranch. The documents were divided. One set in Holt's possession in town, one set inside Clara's coat, pressed against her ribs. Eli rode on the wagon seat between Jack and Clara for the first hour. Then he fell asleep against Jack's arm, his head dropping sideways with the trustful completeness of a child who has decided where safety lives. And Jack adjusted his position slightly so the boy wouldn't fall, and kept driving without comment. Clara watched this happen from the corner of her eye and felt something move in her that was large and quiet and didn't have an easy name. "He's going to ask you questions," she said quietly, "when he's older, about this time,
about what happened.
I know, Jack said.
What will you tell him?
Jack was quiet for a moment, watching the road. The truth, he said, that his father was an honest man who was wronged by a dishonest one. That honest men don't always win, but that doesn't mean you stop being one. He paused. That some fights are worth riding toward. Clara looked at the road ahead, the mountains behind them, Iron Mesa somewhere ahead, the circuit judge 2 days out, and all of it hinging on paper and testimony and a lawyer with fast eyes and 14 years of practice.
Are you afraid? She asked. Not to challenge him, genuinely.
Yes, Jack said, without any hesitation at all. She looked at him. I'm afraid Granger will have gotten to Foster somehow, he said. I'm afraid Rudd will fold before he can testify. I'm afraid... He stopped, his jaw set. I'm afraid something will go wrong that I can't fix.
But you're still riding toward it.
Yes.
Why?
He glanced at Eli, asleep against his arm, then at her. You know why, he said quietly. She did. Iron Mesa looked different from the road coming in. Or maybe it was the same, and she was different. Coming into it this time, not on the back of an auction wagon, with her son's hand clenched in hers and 30 faces looking away, but upright on a wagon seat, next to a man who had not once in 2 months given her a reason to doubt him. Holt met them at the livery stable, which was not a coincidence. He'd been watching for them. He took one look at Clara's face and said, Rudd came to see me this morning. Clara and Jack both went still. He walked into my office at 8 o'clock, Holt said, sat down, and told me everything. The silence that followed lasted about 3 full seconds. Everything, Jack said. The Whitmore lien, the Pearson lien, the Alderman property, a 4th case I didn't know about, a widow named Grace Tatum, 6 years ago, before any of us were paying attention. Holt's expression was composed, but underneath it was the coiled energy of a lawyer who has just watched his case go from strong to overwhelming. He also told me that Granger instructed him, specifically, to watch the Whitmore farm in the fall of 1878 and report whether Daniel Whitmore had submitted any new documentation to the county recorder's office. The air changed. Clara's hand, hanging at her side, closed into a fist.
He was watching Daniel, she said.
Actively, Holt said. He knew Daniel was gathering records. He knew Daniel had found the discrepancy in the interest rate. Holt paused. He knew Daniel was planning to contest the lien. And 3 weeks later, Daniel was dead, Jack said. Holt looked at him carefully. Mr. Callahan, I want to be precise here. Rudd does not have direct knowledge of what happened to Daniel Whitmore. What he has is knowledge that Granger was aware of a potential problem, and that Daniel died before that problem materialized. He paused again. That is not proof of murder. But in the hands of a competent attorney before an honest judge, it is a pattern. And patterns, Mr. Callahan, are often enough. Clara felt the cold move through her, but it was different now from every other time it had come. Not the cold of helplessness, something colder and cleaner than that. The cold of a thing that has been named, of a crime that has been seen. Is Foster honest? She said. I've appeared before him 4 times, Holt said. Yes, he is. Then we have what we need. We have more than we need, Holt said. We have a documented fraud, a corroborating witness, a pattern of prior offenses, and the original signed documents from Daniel Whitmore, with every payment receipted and dated. He looked at her steadily. Clara, this man is going to prison. She had been holding herself very still since Rudd's name was said. Now something shifted. Not a collapse, not tears, Nothing dramatic, just a releasing of something she had been carrying in her jaw and her shoulders and the place behind her eyes for months and months. Since a wet road and a creek bed and a morning when Daniel didn't come home. She breathed. "Good," she said. Granger was arrested the morning of Foster's second day in Iron Mesa. He was not arrested in his bank. He was not arrested quietly, with discretion, in some back arrangement that spared him the kind of public visibility he had always maintained so carefully. Sheriff Beaumont had been given a direct order by Foster's court, and Beaumont, who had maintained his balance between Granger's power and his own official obligations for years, by never being forced to choose definitively between them, had apparently decided, when confronted with a federal circuit judge and a lawyer who had already filed 3 motions before breakfast, that the time for balance had concluded. So Granger was arrested on the steps of the Iron Mesa Bank at 10 in the morning, with Main Street going about its business around him. Clara was across the street when it happened. She had positioned herself there intentionally, not for satisfaction, or not only for that, but because she needed to see it with her own eyes. She needed the thing to be real in her body, not just in her understanding. Beaumont read the charges. Granger stood very still during the reading, with his hands at his sides and his precise features set in an expression Clara had never seen on him before. Not the banker's composure, not the calculated pleasantness, something stripped of all performance. He looked, for the first time, like what he was. When Beaumont finished, Granger turned his head and found Clara across the street. They looked at each other. She did not look away. She did not flinch, and she did not triumph, not outwardly, not in any way she was going to give him. She simply stood and looked at him with the clear and steady gaze of a woman who has spent 2 months doing what he never believed she was capable of. Granger looked away first. Beaumont put a hand on his arm and walked him toward the jailhouse, and the crowd on Main Street parted for them, and Clara watched until they were through the door. Then she felt Jack beside her. He had been somewhere behind her the whole morning, not hovering, not managing, just there, the way he was there, and the solidity of him standing next to her now was something she felt more than saw. "It's done," he said. "Not entirely," she said. "The court hearing is tomorrow. Holt says Foster will hear the full case before he moves on. Holt says it's a formality at this point." "I know." She looked at the jailhouse door. "But I'm going to be in that courtroom. I'm going to sit in that room and watch every moment of it." "I know," Jack said. "I'll be next to you." She turned and looked at him. The morning light was on his face, and she thought about the first time she'd seen that face, dust-covered, trail-worn, riding out of the far end of Main Street on a tired horse. And the distance between that moment and this one felt like a geography she had crossed on foot, every step of it earned. "Jack," she said. "What you said, in the barn, that you'd thought past the settling of this." He looked at her. The careful composure was there, but it was thinner in certain lights than in others, and this was one of those lights. "Yes," he said. "What did you think?" she said. "Past it. What did you see?" He was quiet long enough that she thought he was going to defer again, the way he had that night, telling her just enough to leave the door open without walking through it. But this time was different. This time, the air between them had the quality it only gets after people have been through something real together and come out the other side standing. "You and Eli," he said, "at the ranch, in the mornings when he's out with Cass and you're in the kitchen and the coffee's on and the light comes through the east window." He paused. "That's what I see." Clara held his gaze. "That's a specific thing to see," she said. "Yes," he agreed. "It is." She looked at him for another long moment. Then she turned back toward the direction of the courthouse, where Holt was undoubtedly already preparing tomorrow's arguments, and the street of Iron Mesa moved around them in its ordinary Thursday morning rhythms, indifferent and ordinary, and completely unaware of what had shifted in the air above the two people standing still at its center. "Come on, then," she said, and Jack Callahan fell into step beside her. And for the first time since any of it had started, Clara Whitmore walked through Iron Mesa without her hands clenched and her jaw locked, and the cold water moving through her from the top down. She walked through it like a woman who knew where she was going. And she did. Judge Harlan Foster ran his courtroom the way a man runs a courtroom when he has nothing to prove and no patience for people who do. He was 60, broad-shouldered, and had the particular stillness of someone who had heard every kind of lie a person could tell, and had long since stopped being surprised by any of them. He had read Holt's filing the night before. Clara could tell by the way his eyes moved when Holt stood to present, not following the argument, but verifying it against something already in his head. The courtroom was full. That surprised her. She had half expected the town to stay away, to exercise the same collective avoidance that had characterized Main Street the day of the auction. But the benches were packed. Edna Marsh from the dry goods store sat 3 rows back. Pastor Goodwin was near the window. Jim Hollis, who had ranched next to them and studied the roofline rather than look at her on that platform, was in the back row with his hat in his lap and an expression on his face that looked like a man sitting with something uncomfortable. She did not feel generous toward any of them, but she noted their presence. Jack sat beside her. Eli was at the ranch with Tom and Cass, which had been a negotiation. Eli had wanted to come and had stated his case with the full seriousness of a 6-year-old who believed he had earned the right to see the ending. Clara had told him that some endings were for adults to witness, and that she would tell him every word of it when she came home. He had accepted this with visible reluctance and the quiet dignity of a child who had learned, in recent months, that some decisions were not his to make. Holt presented the case in 40 minutes. He was precise, thorough, and at no point theatrical. He let the documents speak at full volume and kept his own voice at a level that required the room to be quiet to hear him. It was, Clara thought, a very effective technique. By the end of those 40 minutes, the room was so still you could hear the building settle. Then Granger's attorney stood up. His name was Pruitt, and he had ridden from Cheyenne overnight, which was the first indication that Granger had anticipated this proceeding with more seriousness than his composed public exterior had suggested. Pruitt was polished, expensive, and began with the argument that the discrepancy in the loan documents was a clerical error that had since been corrected in the bank's internal records. Holt stood. "Your Honor, I would ask Mr. Pruitt to produce those corrected internal records." Pruitt said the records were at the bank and could be retrieved. Foster said he would wait. Pruitt said it might take some time. Foster looked at his watch. Said he had time. A recess was called. Clara leaned to Jack. "He doesn't have them," she said quietly. "No," Jack said. "He doesn't." The recess lasted 45 minutes. Pruitt came back without the records, with an explanation that involved the bank's filing system and a junior clerk and a fire in a storage room 2 months prior that had destroyed certain documents. The courtroom made a sound, not quite a laugh, something more knowing than that. Foster looked at Pruitt over his glasses for a long time. Then he said, "Counselor, a fire that selectively destroyed the documents relevant to a fraud proceeding is either the most convenient fire in the history of Wyoming, or it is something else. I will allow you one more opportunity to produce original documentation before I draw my own conclusions." Pruitt said he understood. Then Holt called Rudd. Rudd walked to the front of the courtroom like a man walking to his own sentencing. He was pale, and his hands were folded in front of him, and he did not look at the defense table. He sat down in the chair and looked at Holt, and waited. "Mr. Rudd," Holt said, "in your capacity as chief clerk at the Iron Mesa Bank, did you file a lien against the estate of Daniel Whitmore in the amount of $412? "Yes," Rudd said. "Was that the amount Daniel Whitmore actually owed under his original signed loan agreement?" A pause. Short, but the courtroom felt it. "No," Rudd said. The room moved. Foster did not. He watched Rudd with the settled attention of a man who has been waiting for the truthful sentence to arrive, and has just heard it. What amount did Daniel Whitmore actually owe? $35 and some cents, Rudd said, at the rate specified in the original agreement. "And who instructed you to file the inflated amount?" Pruitt was on his feet. Foster overruled him before he finished the objection. Rudd looked at his hands. "Mr. Granger," he said, "he told me the terms had been renegotiated. He told me Daniel had agreed verbally to the new rate." He stopped. "Daniel never agreed to anything." "I knew that. I filed it anyway." The silence after that was the kind that fills a room all the way to the ceiling and leaves no space for anything else. Clara stared straight ahead. Her jaw was locked, not from fear this time, from the effort of staying still inside something that wanted to move very fast and very hard. Jack's hand found hers under the edge of the bench. She held on without looking at him. Rudd's testimony lasted another 20 minutes. He covered the Pearson lien, the Alderman property, and the moment that made the room go cold in a way it hadn't before. Grace Tatum, 6 years ago. A widow with 2 grown children and a water claim on the East Fork. Gone inside a year of Granger starting to circle her property. When Holt asked about Daniel Whitmore's final weeks, Pruitt objected. Foster sustained it. The question of what had happened on that wet road in October was not going to be answered in this courtroom today. Clara had made her peace with that. She had made her peace with it in the barn, on the night Jack said, "I think so too," with the dark outside the window and the documents hidden under the floor. Some things would never be provable. Some things would live in the space between what you knew and what you could demonstrate. But Horace Granger was going to prison, and the land was going to be returned, and Daniel's careful ledger was going to be entered into the official record of Iron Mesa County, and his handwriting, $15, 11 times, faithful and regular, was going to be the thing that outlasted all of it. That was not nothing. That was, in fact, everything she had come back for. Foster called a brief recess. When he came back, he did not sit down. He stood at the bench and delivered his findings standing up, which Clara later learned was unusual for him. Something Holt said he'd only seen once before. "The evidence presented in this proceeding establishes, beyond reasonable doubt, a deliberate and sustained pattern of fraudulent activity," Foster said. "The falsification of the Whitmore loan document is documented, witnessed, and corroborated by the testimony of the bank's own clerk. The pattern of prior offenses, including the Pearson and Alderman matters and the Tatum case, establishes that this was not an isolated error in judgment, but a deliberate and repeated criminal enterprise." He looked at Granger, who was sitting very still at the defense table, with his hands flat on the surface in front of him. "The land and all associated water rights belonging to the estate of Daniel Whitmore are hereby restored to his heir, Clara Whitmore, effective immediately. A warrant is issued for the arrest of Horace Granger on 4 counts of fraud, 1 count of filing a false legal instrument, and 1 count of conspiracy." He paused. "Bailiff?" Granger stood up before the bailiff reached him. He stood up slowly, with the controlled precision that had characterized everything he did, and he buttoned his coat. One button, two, as if he were dressing for a business meeting rather than for handcuffs. Then he looked at Clara. She had been watching him the whole time, waiting for this moment, without knowing she was waiting for it. "You should have taken the settlement," he said. His voice was steady. It was, she realized, the most honest thing he had ever said to her. "You should have been an honest man," she said. Something moved across his face, very briefly, in the space between one breath and the next. That was not quite any of the things she expected. Not rage, not contempt. Something older and more complicated. Something that lived underneath the banker's precision and the cold calculations and the careful, monstrous patience of a man who had been getting away with things for a very long time. Then the bailiff's hand was on his arm, and the moment was gone, and Horace Granger walked out of the Iron Mesa courtroom, and Clara watched him go and felt the cold, the old cold, the auction platform cold, the cold that had lived in her chest since October, leave her body for the first time. Not all at once, gradually, like weather changing, like a season ending. Holt shook her hand outside the courthouse. "The land transfer will be processed within the week," he said. "The county recorder has already been notified. Your husband's deed stands as originally filed." He paused, and something warmer moved through the professional precision for just a moment. "He was a careful man, Daniel Whitmore. Those records were impeccable. You tell whoever taught him to keep accounts that they did good work." "He taught himself," Clara said. "He was that kind of man." Holt nodded. "Yes," he said. "I could see that." He tipped his hat and walked toward the livery stable, and Clara stood on the courthouse steps with Jack beside her and the crowd from inside beginning to move past them on both sides. And Iron Mesa went about the business of an ordinary Thursday afternoon around them, as if the world had not just shifted on its axis. Edna Marsh stopped in front of her. Clara looked at her, waited. Edna's hands were clasped in front of her, and her face had the expression of a woman who has rehearsed something and isn't certain anymore that the rehearsal covered it. "Mrs. Whitmore," she said, "I am sorry. For the day at the platform, I should have—" She stopped. "There is no excuse that covers it." Clara looked at her for a long moment. "No," she said, "there isn't." Edna nodded, pressed her lips together, and walked on. Jim Hollis came next. He didn't say anything at all. He just stopped and held out his hand, and Clara shook it, and he moved on. Sometimes that was all there was to say, and both people knew it. Pastor Goodwin took her hands in both of his and said something about justice being the expression of God's plan in human affairs. And Clara thanked him for coming, and did not say any of the other things she was thinking, because he was a man who had been afraid when it mattered, and she understood that about human beings, even when she didn't forgive it. Jack said nothing through any of this. He stood slightly behind her left shoulder and let the town come to her and held his silence the way he held most things, with a patience that was not passive, but deeply, actively present. When the last of them had passed, she breathed. "Ready to go home?" Jack said. She looked at him. "Which home?" He looked back at her steadily. "Clara, you know the answer to that." She did. She had known it for a while. She had been letting herself know it slowly, in pieces, the way you approach a light that's bright enough to require adjustment. "Eli is going to want his own horse," she said. "He can have whichever one he wants," Jack said. "He'll pick the biggest one." "Probably." "You'll let him?" "Yes," Jack said simply. "I will." Clara looked at the street, at the jailhouse door, at the courthouse steps under her feet, at the auction platform 3 buildings down, still standing, still just wood and iron in the ordinary daylight, incapable now of being anything more than what it was. She looked at it for a long time. Then she turned her back on it. They rode north out of Iron Mesa in the late afternoon, and Clara did not look back this time either, but for a different reason than the first time she'd made this journey. The first time she hadn't looked back because looking back would have broken something. This time she didn't look back because there was nothing behind her worth turning around for. Everything worth having was ahead. Eli saw them coming from the fence line. He must have been watching the road for an hour, because he was up on the second rail with his hand shading his eyes well before they were close enough for him to see their faces. And when he made out who it was, he dropped off the fence and ran toward them in the flat-out, full-body way of a 6-year-old who has been waiting as long as he can and has used up every bit of his patience. Jack pulled the wagon to a stop and climbed down before it had fully settled, and Eli crashed into him at full speed. Small arms, big impact. And Jack caught him and held him in the effortless way he'd developed over weeks without Clara ever noticing exactly when it had started looking so natural. "Did you win?" Eli demanded into Jack's shoulder. "We won," Jack said. Eli pulled back and looked at his face, checking. "All the way?" "All the way." The boy nodded hard, satisfied. Then he looked at Clara, who had climbed down on her own and was standing by the wagon wheel, watching the two of them. And his face went through several rapid expressions before settling into something that was both entirely his own and unmistakably his father's. "Can we stay?" he asked. He was looking at Clara, but the question was also, in the way 6-year-olds include everyone relevant in a single glance, directed at Jack. "Yes," Clara said. "We're staying." Tom Briggs appeared from the direction of the barn and surveyed the scene with the ancient composure of a man who had seen a great many things in his life and had learned to recognize the significant ones. "Supper's on," he said. "Cass burned the biscuits." "I did not," Cass called from inside. "I will determine that independently," Clara said, and walked toward the house, and heard Tom's low, dry sound that was as close as he ever came to laughing, and felt something warm move through her chest that was not so different from the kind of warmth she'd thought she might never feel again after October. That evening, after supper, the biscuits were, in fact, fine, and after Eli had been put to bed and had fought it with every argument a 6-year-old possesses and lost, Clara sat on the front porch with a cup of coffee and the particular silence of a day that has contained more than most days contain and has finally come to rest. Jack came out after a while and sat in the other chair and didn't say anything. They listened to the dark together for a few minutes. "Holt said the water rights are in the deed," Clara said. "The underground water on the south property. It was always there. Daniel knew it. That's what Granger really wanted. What will you do with it?" She had been thinking about this on the ride back, turning it over. "Share it," she said. "The dry summers. The ranchers north of the valley need access to the East Fork. If the water's in the ground under my land, that's not mine alone. That's the valley's." She looked at the dark. "Daniel would have said the same thing." "Yes," Jack said. "He would have." A pause. "Jack," she said. "Why did you really stop that day in Iron Mesa? Before you knew about Daniel's letters? Before you knew about the debt and the fraud and any of it? You were riding through, and you heard the auction, and you stopped." She turned to look at him. "Why?" He was quiet for a long time. Long enough that the night sounds filled the space. The horses in the barn, the grass moving. Somewhere far off, a coyote making its solitary comment on the dark. "I had a sister," he said, finally, quietly. "Younger than me by 8 years. Our father died when she was 12. There was a man who came around after that. A creditor, he called himself. And he had papers, and he said our mother owed money that she didn't owe, and there wasn't anybody to stand up and say that he was wrong. He stopped. I was 15. I didn't know how. I didn't know the words or the law or what you were supposed to do. His jaw tightened. I've known them for a long time now. I've known them for 30 years. And I told myself that if I ever saw that situation again, ever saw a man with papers and a woman with nowhere to go and a crowd looking the other direction, I would know what to do this time. Clara sat with that for a long moment. What happened to your sister? She asked. She was all right, eventually, he said. She's in Ohio, has children of her own. She's fine. He paused. But she was 11 months of not fine first. And I have never forgotten the single day of those 11 months. Clara looked at him, at the profile of a man she had been learning for 2 months, and was going to spend considerably longer learning, she thought, if she had anything to say about it.
A man who had been carrying a 15-year-old debt to Daniel Whitmore and a 30-year-old memory of a little sister and a creditor with false papers, and who had ridden into Iron Mesa on a tired horse with $200 in gold and one sentence ready. I'll take them. Not because she needed taking, because nobody else was going to stand up, and she was the only person in that crowd who understood what it meant if nobody did. I'm glad you knew how, she said. So am I, he said. This time. She reached across the space between the two chairs and put her hand over his, where it rested on the arm of the chair. He turned his hand over and held hers, and they sat like that in the dark, not needing anything else said, the ranch around them quiet and solid and real. Eli's voice came from the upstairs window, small and drowsy, already half asleep. Mama? I'm here, she called up. Is Jack there too? She looked at Jack. Yes, she said. He's here. A pause. Then the contented quiet of a child who has received the specific information he needed and can now sleep. The night settled fully around Callahan Ridge Ranch. The horses were still. The grass moved in a way that was not troubled, but easy. The way things move when they are where they are supposed to be. Clara Whitmore had come to Iron Mesa as a widow, on a platform, with her son's hand in hers, and 30 faces looking away. She had crossed 2 mountain passes on a wagon, and read her dead husband's letters in a stranger's kitchen, and put a case together on a table in the dark, and walked into a courtroom, and watched a corrupt man face what he had built. She had done all of it, and now she was here, on this porch, on this ranch, under this sky, holding the hand of a man who had stopped when no one else would. And that, in the end, was the whole of it. That was the story of how a woman finds out who she is. Not in the easy moments, not in the comfortable ones, but in the ones that strip everything down to what cannot be taken. They could take the platform. They could take the auction and the crowd and the banker with his papers. They could take the riders in the dark and the fire in the storage room and the 6 weeks of fear and planning and holding herself together with both hands. They could take all of it. And what remained, what had remained all along, underneath every attempt to reduce her to a price on a board, was a woman who had known exactly what she was worth. And a man, one man, who had known it too. That was the only miracle Iron Mesa ever produced worth keeping. And it was more than enough.